Well, it's easy to be grumpy. Not that I am ever grumpy. It's easy to be grumpy. You can be grumpy when you haven't eaten. In our household, it's very dangerous if both of us are very hungry. Grumpy when your team loses. Grumpy when the news is all bad. Grumpy when there's too much work to be done. Grumpy when things don't turn out like you expected. And sometimes grumpy when they do turn out like you expected. Grumpy is somewhere between angry and sad, and there seems to be more of it lately. I find more grumpy people than I used to, and it's making me grumpy. Now, this is a particular problem today since we're receiving pledges for the next year, and it's a bad time to be grumpy. It's particularly a problem in the church because there's several reasons why we might be grumpy. It's easy to be grumpy about money. Our money is the result of our efforts. I worked hard at this thing, and it's who I am, and I don't want anybody. It's easy to be grumpy at church. I have to tell you, it's easy to be grumpy at church. When I go to another church, I am sometimes grumpy. There are hundreds of points of doctrine, any one of which might be disagreeable. And when you disagree with a doctrine, you typically don't feel good about it. Oh, that one thing, I really like disagreeing with that position of the church. There's music not to like, ministers to be annoyed with, decisions to be debated. It's amazing the institution stands it all, because there are just so many reasons to be grumpy at church. I'm kind of not exaggerating too much at all. And it's easy to be grumpy when people ask for money. They may not be using it right. They may not do exactly what you want with it. We may feel they're using guilt or pity to manipulate us and take away our hard-earned money. So you put all this together, and most of you are grumpy today. I can only assume. You put the church and the money and the asking for money thing together, and it just sort of all adds up to the fact that there must be some great grumpiness here on the day when we're receiving pledges. In big trouble. But the problem of this grumpiness goes beyond this pledging thing. Because the problem of grumpy is the trajectory of grumpiness. Because you could be grumpy because you're hungry for a little bit until you eat, or you can be grumpy because this, that, or the other thing that goes away. But you know, the more you get used to this grumpiness, the more you decide, or your body or your life goes in the direction of grumpiness. It can lead to selfishness and greed. If we choose for reasons to be mad at the world, we will find plenty of evidence to be mad at the world. We will find human brokenness and sloth. We will see imperfections and threats, grumpiness. We can find alarms and things that should have been fixed. Grumpiness can build on itself until our world shrinks into a gray cloud of doubt and suspicion. And then we start to resent any act of our giving. Our children become leeches, sucking the lifeblood out of us when once they were a joy. Our social relations start being measured in terms of reciprocity rather than in terms of joy. But we don't have to move deeper into grumpiness. We can choose to move out of it. We can choose to have our hearts melted. And thank you, Walt Disney, for showing us how this goes. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Did you know I was going to get there? Yeah. So Grumpy is one of the main characters. Grumpy has more lines than pretty much anybody. Maybe Doc has a few, but who counts these things? Grumpy is one of the main characters, and it is Grumpy who is perhaps the most talented, resents Doc for some of his leadership, but because he's smarter than Doc is, he thinks. And Grumpy is, in short, grumpy. But a very talented person, this Grumpy. The one with the really big schnoz. That's what he's most grumpy about. And there's trials and tribulations and fights. In fact, there's one scene of actual combat between Grumpy and Doc that's cut from the final Snow White, as well it should have been probably. But Grumpy has a change of heart. And it's Grumpy's leadership that rescues Snow White at the climax of the movie. He is won over by kindness and love. Well, we too need to work against grumpiness. And we too need to have our hearts broken and warmed by a love that surpasses our understanding. And this passage is an interesting part of it. This passage, the widow's offering, this passage from Mark, today comes from another world, just like the world of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. This passage comes to us from a world we can just barely understand. A world in which giving to the temple was expected in a number of ways. For thousands and thousands of years, it was presumed that the religious institution that shaped us would get a significant portion of our income. And this has changed. The passage from Mark here is from a completely different world, where poor women and the handicapped led desperate lives on the edge of society. It was a brutal world where people worked hard, long days, few vacations, no retirement, no paid sick leave, no air conditioning. You know, just the air conditioning thing would make me grumpy. There was plenty to be grumpy about. And yet, we don't hear any grumbling in these passages. There's some grumblings when they're wandering in the desert, but no grumbling in these passages about the ministry of Jesus. No grumbling about paying the temple tithe, no resentment about sacrifices made. When they could have been really grumpy. So Jesus works in this world in which we can just barely understand what it's about. And Jesus was often angry at the system which scribes and Pharisees had no heart for the poor. And here he is grateful for this widow who gives all that she possibly can. And it is within the context of this potential grumpiness that Jesus tells story after story about generosity. The Good Samaritan, which is somebody really going out of his way for somebody he didn't have to be generous to in the slightest bit. The prodigal son, the generous father says, okay, I'll split up, and he comes back, and he could have been mad at the kid for going through all the money, easily grumpy at the returning prodigal son, and he throws wise his arms. The lender for giving debts, the workers who arrive late and still get the generous salary promised to the first arrivals, the great banquet parables in which folks are invited in, come on, come to the table. The generosity, the giddy generosity that Jesus tells in the story is also evidenced in the generous actions of Jesus' ministry. In several times in his ministry, Jesus feeds thousands of people with their own generosity, once starting with only the loaves and fishes that a small boy brought. Jesus heals people at the bottom of things. Jesus talks to people at the top of things. Jesus reaches out into the world. And the most important thing are the feelings that are attached to these actions and these stories. What is the widow feeling when she gives all she can? Joy. What is the father of the prodigal son feeling when he welcomes him home? Joy. What are the thousands who are fed, didn't figure they were going to get a free lunch? What are they feeling? Joy. We're getting some food. What are the workers who got paid more than they expected feeling? Joy. Scientific American in 2012, those of you who are suspicious of feelings, we'll get right to the science of it, Scientific American in 2012 confirmed that giving leads to measurable joy. They reported on an experiment in which they wired up a bunch of subjects with electrodes coming out of all parts of their heads, especially those parts that are associated with good feelings. Wired them all up, hooked them up to several machines, and then they walked up to them and said, "Here's $135. I think it really was $135. They figured out exactly what would give people a good jolt. They handed them $135, and they measured all the things that happened, and all the good feelings. They did. I'm not making this up. And then they gave them a piece of paper, and they said, "Well, here's the $135 cash, but it's right here. It's found money. Maybe you want to give some of that away. And here's a list. You give it, we'll make sure that such and such gets some of that money." And some people gave up to half of the money right back. "Oh, yeah, give it to that one." And while they were doing it, they're writing down what's going on in the brain. And they discovered not only was there more juice going to those areas in which people were reporting joy, they were getting more joy out of giving the money away than the joy they got from getting the money. Scientifically. Not only were those areas bigger, more good stuff going on in the brain, but it was leaking over to other sections of the brain, those sections of the brain that have to do with social relations, those subgenual areas involved and implicated in social attachment. There's some other really big words here, but I've cut them all out. And it's sort of those giving things leaked over into other positive social areas of the brain, and all of a sudden, the scientists knew that it's better to give than to receive. Surprise! Stinginess is just not scientific anymore. So generosity might be a kind of cure for grumpiness. Feeling grumpy? Give something away. If you're feeling grumpy generally, this benevolence thing, this generosity thing may snap us out of the cycle of grumpiness that we get in, no matter what our situation. It's paradoxical but true that the way to snap out of grumpiness as a church is to dive in more, to double down, to go all in. The church at Macedonia knew this. Listen to that passage again. During a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and extreme poverty have overflowed into a wealth of generosity on their part. There was something in the news this morning, in the newspaper, a whole big article about some woman who's doing some really wonderful thing for some family member, carrying a child, I don't know. And it seems like a great act of sacrifice. And yet, if you know this person, which I happen to do, this is a great joy for her. A great joy of giving. That smarty widow that Jesus watched must have known all this. She outlived her grumpy husband, that's for sure. Perhaps she outlived her workaholic son because nobody was taking care of her anymore. That grumpiness did not survive, but the widow did. Even in her poverty, she had a better life than those posturing scribes. She knew the joy of sacrifice, the power of attitude. Her greater generosity gave her a joy the scribes would never know. And Jesus, the rabbi of joy, saw it and saw the look on her face and saw the warm smile as the woman dropped the coins in the box. And Jesus smiled too.